Hi, this is Jessie Bricker, and I am presenting on evidence-based practice with my capstone project, which is involving transition to work services for individuals with autism spectrum disorder. So just a little introduction. We know that autism spectrum disorder affects 1 in 68 Americans, and we have over 500,000 individuals on the spectrum who will be aging into adulthood in the next decade, which leaves a large percentage of people who really are going to be transitioning into all those adult roles. And so what's important to note is that less than 1% of our research on autism actually pertains to adult issues for individuals on the spectrum. And yet there's been a recent momentum shift in the workforce, particularly in being interested in hiring and recruiting individuals who have autism spectrum disorders due to their strengths and individual capabilities in the workplace, which is going to set the stage for the need to really develop some specific accommodations and supports for those individuals. So just a little bit about the autism population. Nearly half the individuals with ASD have average to above average intelligence, putting them in the high functioning category. We know that these individuals especially can voice their desires to have all the same typical social milestones that other young adults meet, such as having a family, competitive employment, and a place to live on their own. They have strengths in the workplace, including dependability, innovative thinking, problem solving, low absenteeism rates, real asset in any work setting, really. Several studies, though, report greater risk for anxiety, depression, and even suicide rates in the autism population, and that has a lot to do with the challenges that they face in transitioning into young adulthood. We know that competitive employment rates with individuals on the spectrum is significantly lower, both in terms of comparing those individuals to their typical peers, but also other disability categories such as nonverbal learning disorders or behavioral disorders as well. In terms of intervention, inadequate work transition programs and supports are really kind of the take-home message in the literature. We know that many individuals that are on the spectrum become disconnected after they graduate from high school, and disconnection is sort of a policy term in terms of government, meaning that those individuals are not pursuing continuing education, and they're also not working. And so that begs the question, what are they doing during the day? And many times that's one of the reasons that you see a high incidence of anxiety and depression in that population, because they're not engaged in the community. There is a paucity of research identifying effective supports for these individuals, especially in terms of just adult life transitions, but specifically with work transitions. However, the project search model seems to be one of the models that's showing efficacy in terms of helping individuals with all disabilities get gainfully employed. And especially with the autism population, they have particularly good outcomes, employing anywhere from 70 to 80% of the interns in their program that have autism. But definitely, even within the project search model, they're demonstrating some lower outcomes compared to other disability groups, and that's been kind of sort of a thing that the project search as a whole is interested in looking at as well, but really kind of highlights the fact that there might be some individual needs there that are not really met in a typical traditional work training model. There's definitely an under-involvement of occupational therapy across the board in transition planning, but specifically looking at transitioning to work in adult life, we know that we don't see a lot of practitioners that are doing that kind of work, especially in vocational training or even at the secondary level, preparing individuals for adult work situations. In terms of comparison, we're just kind of looking at what is in existence for individuals on the spectrum as they are seeking competitive employment. Some are involved in more traditional voc rehab programs and support employment. Others are not receiving any services at all because they don't qualify for those services. We know that it's challenging for them either way. Only between 6 to 10% of individuals on the spectrum are competitively employed in community settings, and some of those are not even full-time positions. But we do have policies in place that protect them, like the ADA. We know that they can, request some accommodations and supports. There's just not really a standardized, line of thinking about what is going to be specifically effective in helping them to maintain employment. However, there is some emerging literature that talks about sensory-friendly environmental accommodations, thinking about visual supports, utilizing written communication strategies instead of face-to-face, and even thinking about cultural sensitivity training for coworkers. Adults with ASD can be successfully employed, particularly if they're employed in an area of intense interest. And so leveraging that as a strength is something that's sort of a unique idea that could really help with maintaining employment over time. Project search programs are particularly interested in looking at what these accommodations are because they're trying to address these lower outcomes for this subset of people on the autism spectrum. So they're launching NEXT, which is their kind of autism-specific training. But again, they don't routinely incorporate occupational therapy. So the real question is whether or not individuals with autism who are getting project search services would do better with more occupation-based, client-centered types of transition planning and intervention. And so there's a couple of different scales that I think would be interesting to incorporate as I'm doing my project in terms of looking at matching. So strengths-based matching and finding goodness of fit between an individual's unique characteristics and the work that they plan to do, and then also looking at self-determination as a marker of empowerment and being able to maintain employment over time because you're able to troubleshoot when those issues arise, what you should do about it. And so I think both of those are really important to consider in terms of looking at comparison data. And then outcomes are really, I've already kind of iterated what those are, but really just looking at the project search employment rate for individuals with autism spectrum disorder compared to not only the non-intervention group, individuals who are not receiving any type of training or supported employment, but also other more traditional forms of supported employment like vocational rehab. And then looking at interns with ASD in terms of what specific strategies or accommodations or supports they might need. So some of the things that we're already looking at in terms of the Project Next sort of subset program is that intensive skill-based training with more of a behavioral modification approach and then incorporating visual supports. But there are still some holes there, thinking about occupation and client-centered ways of strategizing their intervention plan or the types of jobs that they're aligned to take is really important. And then thinking about on the demand side what training can be done for a potential employer, for coworkers who are looking at working with an individual on the spectrum, just to kind of prepare them for some of the challenges that they might encounter. So really the project search programming model right now doesn't really incorporate the lived experience of individuals with ASD or their voice in determining what are those key elements that they really need in order to be successful. And I think that's something that my project specifically is going to contribute. There's a lot of application to consider. I think really my particular project here is more of an action research project which goes in phases, a phase of qualitative data collection, strategizing around some program changes, and then an implementation phase with a subsequent data collection phase that kind of looks at the differences between what happened before and after that intervention phase. And so for me, I think that utilizing evidence-based solutions to work-related barriers is going to be essential to communicating the role and scope of an OT, not just for this program design, but really thinking about it in terms of what the larger contribution could be in outlining some of the key elements to accommodations and supports for individuals on the spectrum as they go out and seek competitive employment. Anything like just thinking about their interview strategies or how they might put together their resume or their portfolio could be helpful in helping them to attain jobs that are along the lines of their education level and their interests. And then using clinical judgment and decision making as an individual practitioner in that process is important, just to demonstrate all of the facets of utilizing that evidence-based research in practice, thinking about the clinical relevance for an individual client as I listen to their specific needs and their challenges from their own perspective is going to be a really big part of this project. And I think it will help to shape what that project next ends up looking like. Clinical implications are significant, I feel like, for this project. We know that there's a huge gap between evidence-based research and implementation, but specifically, one of the barriers with this project is the overall perceptions of occupational therapists who work in pediatric settings as they're working with adolescents sort of transitioning into this adult phase, and also just with young adults thinking about their role within work settings. Largely, we don't see a lot of occupational therapists involved in that transition process. And many times they don't feel that they have any influence over that transition process unless the client they're working with may have a specific assistive technology or motor barrier that needs to be addressed. And so just really thinking about what is the overall role and scope of an occupational therapist in terms of improving self-efficacy or looking at helping someone leverage their strengths to find goodness of fit, or even the social participation components of conflict resolution are really important pieces of that. And then kind of along those lines, there's new funding that's opened up with the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act that really it mandates states to spend 15% of their voc rehab budget in creating this bridge between secondary and post-secondary life. And so I feel like that is a real opportunity for occupational therapists to get involved in working with individuals who are transitioning to work. Workforce trends are really important to consider too. I think that occupational therapists using evidence-based practice can communicate better with other agencies, other industries, administrators about what does the literature say about what has efficacy in supporting individuals in the workplace, and that will be very powerful. So how do we fill this gap? Project Search is a very specific model that has a braided funding stream, which means there's lots of stakeholders at the table. And I think that getting occupational therapists a seat at this table is going to be essential. So I'm really looking at forming partnerships between the university systems, the medical center that I'll be working at, and the different community stakeholders who might be employing these individuals when they graduate. Just really a big opportunity for a wide dissemination of evidence-based knowledge there. And then I'm hoping eventually I'll be able to incorporate collaboration with students as they transition into field work in this setting, because the student voice can be more of a partnership, I believe, than just a one-way street of learning. And I think that students have a lot to offer in terms of their ability to access technology. They're adept at searching the databases or knowing how to access different pieces of information quickly. And that can be a real asset to a therapist who's been out in the field for a few years and maybe isn't as well versed in utilizing technology in those ways, to really gain some information quickly about what has efficacy around it. And so I think that will help to shape current therapists' perceptions of what their role and scope is. And then I'm also hoping to be able to publish so that I can shed light specifically on the lived experience of individuals on the spectrum that are transitioning into work. So next steps, there's a lot of different ways this could go, but my hope is that I can use some of these critical thinking and clinical reasoning pieces to really highlight what an occupational therapist can do in affecting change within practice. Incorporating just all those pieces of evidence-based practice and using them for a wide variety of professionals, not just other occupational therapists. In terms of dissemination, I'm hoping to talk to my faculty at the summer retreat, but I also have a few conferences that I'm interested in attending, and I'm thinking about a lunch and learn opportunity for clinicians who are in our area that are interested as well. So that's just kind of my plan for dissemination of knowledge there. And then these are some of my references. There's a lot of references, sorry. But thanks for listening, and I appreciate your feedback. All right, goodbye for now.